Okay. Hello and welcome to NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Tracy Gill. Today and for all Tuesdays through early June, I am co-hosting a science seminar series with Jami Shrestha, Director of U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office. Dr. Shrestha will offer some information on the background for this series and introduce the seminar and speaker. But before she does, here are some logistics and related information. The presenter today is fine with clarifying questions during the seminar. Please type them into the chat box. If you are interested in getting a PDF copy or recording of today's presentation, we will list the website in the chat box where you can find them in a few days. Or you can contact tracy.gill@noaa.gov or Jami Shrestha, and we will be happy to send you a copy. If you are not on NOAA's weekly seminar list but would like to be, please email me at tracy.gill@noaa.gov and I will add you to the seminar list. Folks in the room, please sign in and silence your phones. And now I will hand over the mic to Jami Shrestha to introduce the seminar and speaker. Jami?
Thanks, Tracy. Hello, I am Jami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office and co-host of this webinar series today with Tracy Gill from NOAA. Today's seminar is the 9th in a 3-month seminar series titled From Science to Solutions, the State of the Carbon Cycle, which is focused on communicating the second state of the Carbon Cycle Report findings in relation to current and broader societal impacts and solutions. This series is sponsored by the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program in partnership with NOAA. For those who don't know about the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program, we are an interagency partnership led by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group.
I'm actually having problems with the sound. I'm having problems with the sound anyway.
We coordinate and facilitate federally funded carbon cycle research with the science community, and we provide leadership to the U.S. Global Change Research Program on carbon cycle science priorities. We are one of the longest-running U.S. interagency partnerships in global change research. Most recently, we led the development of the second state of the carbon cycle report with a diverse team of over 200 U.S. and international experts for over 3 years. This decadal assessment underwent rigorous multi-draft peer review by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the public, and 13 federal agencies and departments before its release in late 2018. On the occasion of Earth Day yesterday, we released a new metadata embedded website for this assessment. The website is carbon2018.globalchange.gov. Check it out, it is beautiful. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to express our deep gratitude to NOAA and Tracy Gill, as well as all webinar speakers for making this webinar series possible. Also thanks to NOAA for helping this newly unveiled assessment website for the State of the Carbon Cycle Report possible too. For your future reference, the recording of prior webinars in this special seminar series are available on the YouTube channel of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program. All pertinent slides and details of the webinar series are available on the program website carboncyclescience.us. Today's seminar speaker is Dr. Maureen McCarthy, who will address how Indigenous practices contribute to carbon management and climate adaptation. Dr. McCarthy is one of the 33 chapter leads of the State of the Carbon Cycle Report. She led the development of the Tribal Lands chapter. Maureen was also a key member of the team that produced the cover image of the assessment, which you can see on carbon2018.globalchange.gov. Now I will tell you more about Dr. Maureen McCarthy's background. Dr. McCarthy is the Director of Tahoe and Great Basin Research at the University of Nevada-Reno. She is a faculty member in the graduate program in Hydrologic Sciences and research faculty member at the Desert Research Institute. Her portfolio includes large multi-institutional transdisciplinary research programs focused on climate resiliency, water sustainability, natural resource management, and multi-hazard early warning. Maureen is Project Director for the Water for the Seasons project, a multi-institution research project focused on climate adaptation and water sustainability in snow-fed arid land river systems, and the Native Waters on Arid Lands project, a research extension partnership with 1862 and 1994 land-grant institutions, tribal communities, and research institutions focused on enhancing the climate resiliency of Native American agriculture. Before moving to University of Nevada-Reno, Dr. McCarthy directed WMD research, weapons of mass destruction research, intelligence, and treaty compliance programs in Washington, D.C. for the Department of Homeland Security, Energy, and Defense. Immediately following 9/11, she served as senior advisor in the Executive Office of the President. She was a Lady Davis postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Israel, and holds a PhD in chemical physics from the University of Colorado and a BSc in chemistry from Boston College. It's an honor to have Maureen speak here, I would say. Welcome, Maureen, and thanks for presenting your work at the NOAA SOCCR2 Science Seminar today. Maureen?
Jami, thank you for that lovely introduction. This is Maureen McCarthy, and I am delighted and thrilled to be able to present to you some of the findings from the Tribal Lands chapter for the state of the carbon cycle. I appreciate the introduction, but I will tell you that this contribution I represent is the chapter I represent and I'll be talking about today is really the culmination of many contributors to this project. So on this first slide, just so you know who we are, these are the authors on the chapter. But there were many other people who helped us along the way, including fabulous reviews from the National Academy of Science and many who gave us input. So on the chapter itself, my co-authors were Beverly Ramsey, who had been the Earth and Ecosystems Services Director, Sciences Director for Desert Research Institute. She has subsequently retired and is working in the private sector. Margaret Redsteer, who many of you may have known when she was at USGS. She is now at the University of Washington, Bethel. And John Phillips, who is the director of the First American Land Grant Consortium, which is the consortium of all the tribal colleges and universities across the United States. And just by way of background, Beverly is a member of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation, and Margaret Redsteer is a member of the Navajo Nation. So I'm going to jump into this. Please feel free to interrupt if you have questions along the way. But let me start by answering the question that was asked when we started, as Jami said, you know, in the 3 years of the development of the SOCCR project, but also where we encountered this question along the way. And that was, why include tribal lands as a separate chapter in SOCCR? So many of you who have looked at the carbon cycle report understand the structure of the report was meant to look at carbon cycling on different land types and in different environments. So there's a grasslands chapter, a coastal chapter, a boreal forest chapter, waterways, inland waterways chapter. Those are specific land types. And then there's urban environments and transportation and energy sources. So why include tribal lands as a separate chapter? Well, first and foremost, I think the thing to remember for everybody is that the indigenous peoples in North America, and now I'm talking not just the United States, but also Canada and Mexico, they have been on the land and informing the land, and as a result, impacting the carbon cycle in North America for somewhere on north of 12,000 years. So they are part of the ecosystem that we live with. So it is and they have a different perspective and a different view. Their traditional practices of farming, ranching, and natural resource stewardship is significantly different than what we call the monoculture practices that got introduced to the North America from European settlers. So the difference, what I'll be highlighting today, is the difference in those practices and how we deduce how the carbon cycle may be different on tribal lands. They also have inherent practices that are tied to the land, and as a result are, even if not specifically aimed at managing carbon stocks and fluxes, they certainly are connected to them. And then, as for the negative side of this, with European settlement, with natural resource exploitation, energy growth during the 20th and 21st centuries, fossil fuel uranium extraction on tribal lands has had a huge impact, and as a result has impacted carbon emissions, both from the actual processes of extracting coal and gas, but also from degradation of the land. So moving on to the findings, and I'm only going to highlight 3 findings in this talk for time. So if you want the rest of the details, it's a lengthy chapter with lots of references. So please feel free to look at it on the SOCCR website. So first and foremost, as I mentioned before, the traditional practices of agriculture and land use implemented by the indigenous peoples across the United States, Canada, and Mexico are distinctly different. And we know that because we see that, we understand their practices. In contrast to that, there are, in the second finding, essentially 0 scientific data measuring carbon stocks and fluxes on tribal land. As a matter of fact, there's very little measurements, physical measurements on a lot of tribal lands right now. And that could include met stations. There are a few met stations, there are, a few stream gauges, but there hasn't been the level of study of soils and management practices and their effect on carbon. So what we wind up doing is looking at similar land types and contrasting tribal practices on grasslands and forests, and look at how that compares to non-tribal lands and try and deduce what the impact could be on the carbon cycle. And then the third finding, which I mentioned earlier, which is really the role the tribal lands has played in fossil fuel extraction, has been significant, and as a result, disproportionate contribution to carbon stocks and fluxes. So let me just start with, to capture what I mean by indigenous practices versus European practices, particularly when it comes to agriculture. So remember that the indigenous people in North America are predominantly agrarian based. It could be forestry, it could be on the coastal environments, it could be fisheries, crops for sustenance, crops for traditional practices, and crops even for economic well-being. So the practices, the agricultural practices developed over thousands of years are distinctly different than what was introduced by European settlement. And for those of you who have an interest, I highly recommend the book Braiding Sweetgrass. She captures the differences in these practices, but what she's pointing out in this quote in particular is the notion that the traditional practices tended to plant crops together in the ground rather than long rows of separate crops, monoculture crops. And in doing so, they affected the soil, they affected the productivity, they affected the way water was used. And this was very different. And the clash between these two agricultural practices has had an impact on carbon retention in the soils and also how the plants were managed for long-term longevity of the agricultural practices. So as I pointed out in the two findings, we know that traditional practices are different, and we also know that there's very little specific, what we would call Western science approach to measuring carbon stocks and fluxes on tribal lands. So what this figure is meant to illustrate is the indigenous, or what we call native wisdom, is this process which is always cyclical. Native science moves in a cycle. It is moves from indigenous ecology, traditional forestry, traditional ranching, farming, gathering plants and animals. It connects and always has a tie between soil, water, air, the animals, humans and non-human animals, and the plants. So that cyclical nature of how traditional practices are implemented really has an impact on the land. And they all point towards this notion: if we can merge them with Western science, collecting data, analyzing it, research the technologies we introduce, we can quantify more specifically the impact that these practices have on carbon management, among other things, and also on climate adaptation. So one of the things I think that's important to note is that traditional practices inherently contribute to managing carbon stocks, even if that's not their first intention. So things that are common in the agricultural world to minimize, to retain soil, to minimize runoff and degradation of soils, no-till farming. Well, no-till farming is done across tribal lands throughout North America, mostly because they can't afford other equipment, and it is they still use, particularly in traditional practices in sustenance agriculture, they still use practices that were introduced 1,000 years ago. So this could be dry land or irrigated lands. There's also a practice of moving livestock seasonally in accordance with forage availability, which means not keeping the livestock on any given part of land for any long periods of time. So no large cattle ranch located in a single area. There's a lot of focus on growing legumes and cover crops in concert with food crops, which means that you're replenishing the soils continuously, so not growing one crop in the area. Also raising livestock and plants that are common to the ancestral landscape from over thousands of years. And many of these areas have gone through very stressed period, either through droughts or through floods. And so these ancestral plants and animals have had a chance to adapt to the landscape. And then probably one of the biggest issues, and particularly for those of us in the West, is this notion of managing forests with fire, managing the landscape, not just forests, but meadows with fire on the landscape. That's been used for thousands of years and continues to be used by many communities. So from the chapter, I'm just going to pull out a few of the case examples that we discuss. And these are case examples meant to illustrate sort of a positive impact on climate, on the carbon, retaining carbon stocks and on carbon sequestration. So the first one that I'll mention, which we describe in more detail, is a project that was called the Pueblo Farming Project. And it was a collaboration with the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado, with the Hopi and Zuni farmers. Now, these are all dryland farmers implementing practices that they've been following for several thousand years. And again, this is the crossover between native wisdom and Western science. So the archaeologists measured, followed the planting cycle, followed the farmers as they planted corn, and tested the corn that they had self-selected for drought resistance. So the Hopi, knowing that they have been through many long periods of drought in the past, have been very effective in selecting drought-resistant corns and then understanding how the soils are at the beginning of the season and knowing which corns to plant. As a result of their practices, we've seen crops grow resilient, particularly the corn, to major changes in the climate, including long periods of drought and heat waves. We also they measured specifically the soil health parameters as these different corn were introduced, and discovered that the soils had remained healthier for longer. They were able to minimize the use of water, and as a result, maintain carbon stocks in the soils as a result of these. So this is one of the types of climate adaptation that was demonstrated from traditional practices. The second one is a project that is now being developed by Oregon State University, but had been introduced by a colleague of ours who is from the Cheyenne River tribe. And he introduced the concept of the reintroduction of what they called the buffalo dance. This was practices from the Central Plains area, where they essentially turn the garden into a mimic what goes on in the buffalo gut. And so what they're doing is finding ways to compost in between rows of planted crops. And in that composting, designed to enhance the soils, really provide nutrients in the soils, increase the carbon sequestration in the soils, while you're also producing crops. So this, the picture on the left here shows the composting tracks. These are sunflower stalks that they put in the bottom, and then any compost material on top. In this case, it happened to be alfalfa bales. And this is between individual rows of planted crops, as you can see in this. My pointer. As you can see over here are the rows of crops, and then this is the composting trench here. This is specifically targeting improving soil quality while producing crops, and in the process of doing this, allowing more soil to be retained more carbon to be retained in the soils. An example that we talk about in the ranching community is the reintroduction of the Navajo Churro sheep. So the Navajo were great sheep farmers for thousands of years, and they had a strain of sheep that they had obtained from the Spanish that were called the Churro sheep. And they were very hardy and very adaptable to climate extremes. They also move on the landscape very differently than Western sheep in that they don't congregate, they move more as individuals. Like the buffalo, they move very quickly when they graze, so they have less of an impact on the soils. But In the case of the Navajo Churro sheep, they were culled by the U.S. government. The sheep were known to be disease resistant, particularly for desert environments. But in the 1860s and the 1930s, the U.S. government decided that these sheep were totally inappropriate and basically wiped and nearly destroyed the entire strain, and then forced the Navajo to grow Western sheep. Now, as you know, Western sheep grow well in New Zealand and Scotland and England, and not so well in the Mesa Verde area of the Four Corners in southwestern United States. Despite that setback, luckily they did retain enough individual animals that the Navajo Churro sheep have been reintroduced and are thriving back in their home areas in northern New Mexico and Arizona. And the reintroduction of this strain of sheep has resulted in, first of all, the sheep are healthier. The soils are healthier. They're able to graze in areas that weren't able to be grazed before. And we're having a positive ecological impact of bringing the sheep back, as well as a positive economic impact for the tribes themselves. So that was a reintroduction of a traditional practice that has had positive environmental impacts as well. So then let me turn to my last example, which is forestry. And I mentioned that forestry is a big part, and how the tribes have managed the forest has been a big part of really protecting carbon stocks on the landscape. So in this case, I'm looking at the Salish and Kootenai Forest Management Program. And the Salish and Kootenai are in Montana. They're in northwest Montana. And they manage forests that abut against U.S. Forest Service managed lands right adjacent to it. So in that case, we have a clear comparison of the differences in forestry management practices by the tribes on their lands that they control, contrasted to the U.S. Forest Service practices that have been going on for the last 100+ years. And obviously, as many people know, the U.S. Forest Service has for at least over 100 years followed fire suppression at all costs practice. The tribes did not. They followed a very different way of managing their forest. In particular, they use fire on the landscape a lot. They also have programs where they specifically are looking at protecting the forest structures as they were for their traditional practices. So they're looking at protecting species in the forest, both the trees and the understory that provide habitat, and they provide traditional plants and foods. So their method of managing the forest is distinctly different. It looks different. They tend to manage in clumps where they're not just looking at the trees themselves, but they're looking at the understory. So they have areas where it's heavily wooded, and then areas where there's clearing for plants and animals to thrive. This has helped maintain carbon stocks in the forests, also maintain more healthier forests. And it was demonstrated recently by the bad wildfire season in Montana, one of them a few years ago, when they had 3 fires that had started outside of the reservation that were burning. And when they hit the reservation, because of their fire management practices, the fires either went out or were easily contained. Because their distinctly different pattern on the landscape they've had few catastrophic wildfires, and as a result, have maintained the carbon stocks on the landscape there. So that was good news. You know, those are good news. That was the description of a few case studies of where tribal traditional practices, indigenous traditional practices, have contributed in what we'll call a beneficial way to carbon management. They've maintained carbon stocks in the soils. They've prevented environmental ecological degradation. They've kept carbon stocks in the forests. These are ways that have had a positive benefit. Now, as I highlighted earlier, and I'll get into a little more in the next slide, the bad news is that tribal lands have been prone to exploitation by the national governments, federal governments. In the United States, this is same is true in Mexico and also in Canada. I'll use just cite a few examples from the United States to put this in context. So when you look at carbon emissions, on the flip side, fossil fuel and uranium extraction have had a huge and a disproportionate footprint on tribal lands as compared to non-tribal lands, which has contributed substantially to carbon and methane emissions, and also the result of from those practices in particular, but also a result of environmental degradation, which further exacerbates the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. So to put this in context, fossil fuel and uranium energy resources on tribal lands are, like I said, are substantial and are disproportionate as compared to non-tribal lands, with 30% of the coal reserves west of the Mississippi on tribal lands, 50% of the uranium reserves, and 20% of oil and gas. Now, the important thing to remember is not only are these resources on tribal lands, many of them having already been exploited and as a general rule left in environmentally precarious states, but they have also been resulted in being the livelihood for many tribes. So if you drive through the Southwest, if you go through areas in New Mexico and Arizona, all the way up into Montana, you will see oil and gas fracking wells now on many tribes. But perhaps one of the most distinctly impactful events is on the tribes was the creation of the Navajo Generating Station. So the Navajo Generating Station is the largest coal-fired power plant in the western United States. And it is still running, but not for long. The picture on the So the picture on the left is a picture of the Navajo Generating Station, which is actually located on the Navajo reservation. The picture on the right is the coal mining, predominantly on the Hopi Reservation, which, for those of you who don't know, the Hopi Reservation is embedded in the Navajo Reservation, so it's surrounded on all sides by Navajo. So in the middle of the reservation, the Hopi Peabody mines have been not only the source of coal for the Navajo Generating Station, they've been the source of almost all the jobs on the reservation. And they've been the source of coal for heating houses for the Hopi. And that's their primary source of heat. Together between the mine and the energy station and the lease deals that with the private companies who have built these plants, the revenues have generated somewhere on the order of about 85% of the income for the Hopi since these plants have been running, and about 65% for the Navajo. In a positive step towards reducing carbon emissions in the United States, and because the cost of fracking natural gas is so cheap, the Salt River Project that's been running the plant made the decision to shut down the plant entirely. The plant, the mines, everything, at the end of this year, so 2019. So this is timely. And, that's positive. I live in the state of Nevada. Nevada has just passed the renewable portfolio standard increase yesterday. They announced it. So by 2030, they have to be at 30% or 50% renewables. And one of the ways to do that was to cut off getting power from Navajo Generating Station. So we weren't buying coal-fired electricity. And that's true for most of the states. So there's no market for this. The Navajo considered taking over the plant, but recognized that they couldn't sell the electricity. So when you look at this transition and you think about indigenous communities who have a very strong connection culturally and spiritually to the land, the water, obviously coal-fired power has had a huge impact on the landscape in a negative way, in an environmental way, which they're well aware of, also on water resources and everything else. But it's been their major source of income. And if there isn't a transition plan, it's going to be exceedingly difficult. So when we look at tribal lands, we have to think not only of the impacts in positive ways of how they've adapted, but also the impacts that Western society has had on the tribes, essentially capturing them in this cycle of needing to generate revenues. And one of the easiest ways to generate revenues when you have a lot of reserves is to allow for fossil fuel exploitation on the reservations. So in that regard, the tribal lands have a very different perspective than non-tribal lands. And I think one of the challenges that we face as we look forward, we can learn a tremendous amount from the indigenous peoples for how they manage their land, how they worked to preserve the health of plants and animals and soils and air and water holistically. But we also then have to recognize that people need to eat and they need to survive. And if we want to lessen the impact of carbon emissions from fossil fuel extraction in particular, because obviously the tribes don't use this electricity, it's being shipped to somewhere else, but they're going to be left with the burden of what happened during the extraction processes. So let me just summarize so that I have plenty of time to take your questions. I think you probably got it in my talk. There are key takeaway messages from the Tribal Lands chapter. That I think that, highlighting the fact that indigenous land stewardship is inherently tied to carbon cycling, even if it's not the purpose of why it's being done. And that in indigenous agricultural practices in particular, including forestry and fishing and coastal ecosystem survival is very different from the monoculture agriculture introduced to this country. And as a result, it has a different impact on carbon processes. The practices, even though they may not be economically as don't have the same return that big scale monocultural agriculture has, they certainly have the ability to enhance soil and plant health in conjunction with food production, which helps with carbon uptake and keeps the carbon stocks where we want them to be, in the soils and in the plants and not in the air. They also, fundamentally, there are very few measurements. So coming off of this is probably, we hope will spin more research to quantify these practices, because I think there's a lot we can learn from understanding the comparison between traditional and non-traditional practices. And we need both. We need to merge Native wisdom and Western science. And then we have to recognize this huge impact that we've had from fossil fuel extraction and uranium extraction, leaving the landscape in a precarious position, but also leaving the communities in a precarious economic position, where they've become dependent on things that we would like to have reduced to lessen the carbon emissions. But on the other hand, we have to do something to make sure that internally those communities are not left with no source of income, and can go back or transition to livelihoods based on their traditional practices. So with that, I am going to close. You have my contact information. You are more than welcome to contact me at any time. I've put a URL to one of our project sites, which has several resource material in there about processes on tribal lands. But most important, the SOCCR2 report, as Jami said, is on a beautiful new website as of yesterday. And I encourage you to look at it, look at the references. And with that, I thank Jami and Nancy Cavallero for fabulous leadership on this chapter and the report, and for all of my colleagues, tribal and non-tribal, who taught me so much about what carbon cycling means on tribal lands and contributed to this effort. So with that, I will take your questions.
Great. Thank you, Maureen. Folks online, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box. Sometimes it'll take a few minutes, Maureen.
No problem.
And while we're waiting for questions, you can see that Jami has posted a lot of the relevant links to the SOCCR2 reports, and also to the previous webinars and PDFs that you can listen to from YouTube, or download the PDFs for most, if not all, of the seminars. We still have a few seminars left. They go through early June. So please join us the following Tuesday for our next seminar. And I see we have some questions coming, or I thought we did.
I saw somebody was typing.
Yeah. Maureen, I have no idea of the population of all the Native Americans in the U.S. Do you have any idea of the numbers of people?
Yes, and when you look at tribal populations, recognize that the majority of Native Americans, whether they're Canadian or from the U.S. or Mexico, do not live on reservation properties. Majority of them live on non-tribal lands. So you're talking tens of millions of people who are associated or members of tribes. The majority of them live in urban environments or off reservation. But the reservations themselves capture, and in the chapter we go through, we have a lot of background of exactly, all the facts and figures of which are the largest reservations and how much land it captures. So I encourage people to look at that. The Navajo reservation is the single largest reservation in the United States. And the population on the tribal population there is 25,000 maybe living on the reservation.
Okay.
And then large communities off of that. But land mass, we're talking, Navajo reservation is about 20 million acres. And then the the big reservations in Montana are typically 2 to 5 million acres. So it's substantial chunks of land. And typically they are the least desirable land that the United States didn't take. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions. Nancy asked about sheep herders. Have information on the management of buffalo. Yes. So in addition, I use the case of the Navajo sheep just because I've been working with them, but I've also worked with the tribes in Utah and also in Oklahoma and other places that have reintroduced buffalo on the landscape. The buffalo strains that they typically are bringing back are not pure bison. They are, they have some cattle DNA in them. But they are having, again, the buffalo graze totally different than cattle. They spread out as individuals and they move very fast across the grasslands when they're grazing, so they don't pull the roots up of the grasses. And so that's having a positive impact. And one of the tribes in Utah is now reintroducing the buffalo and using that as an economic resource to compensate for getting out of some of the oil and gas, particularly fracking that they've got going on. So yes, Nancy, I can give you lots of buffalo references. Gary, did you look at the effects of the imposition of Western property and governance system on carbon sequestration allotment? Yes. I didn't go into detail on the talk, but we do talk extensively about the way that Western settlers came in and they brought with them the concept of land ownership, which was anachronistic to traditional communities when there wasn't really individual ownership of land. That forcing, when they wanted to take care of their tribes, if you will, and establish the reservations in the United States and put the land in trust, then they forced individual farmers to have allotted land that they would farm rather than farming collectively. That has had a big impact on the ability to sustain ecologically sound landscapes because it forced fragmentation of the land. So we do discuss that, and I also have several references on that particular topic, but the land tenure issue is a major issue. In Canada has, their native communities have what we would call reservations, First Nation communities. In Mexico, they did not. They actually didn't even give them allocations to land. So there's the impacts there are even more substantial. Oh, thank you, Fred. Today, there are over 5 million Native Americans in the United States, 78% who live outside the reservations. Thank you for quoting that. I knew we had it in there. I appreciate that. So that tells you that the majority of the Native Americans, at least in the United States, and this is true of Canada, live off reservations. But the reservation lands themselves is where, for the most part, traditional practices have been maintained. Let's see. Okay, those are the key questions. Please let me know if you have any other questions. You're free to contact me anytime. And as I mentioned, this chapter is very dense. We even have an appendix to this chapter, which gives a breakdown of the practices, the locations, the distribution of populations, and different tribes in different areas across Canada, US, and Mexico. And we also talk about the predominant practices in terms of agrarian practices, where oil and gas, fossil fuel has been extracted, and those types of things. Obviously, for most of you who know the distribution of tribal communities in the United States, the majority of the reservations are in the western United States, because most of the indigenous lands in the east were confiscated and the tribes forced west. So, and then some tribes are living on lands that were not from their ancestral homeland, like the displacement of the Cherokee and the tribes from the east to Oklahoma. The Navajo and the Hopi are living on ancestral lands that they have been on for thousands of years, albeit much more compact than it was prior to Western settlement. But they have an understanding of the land that goes back thousands of years. So one of the things that I think we forget, unless we're out working in the communities, that remembering from tradition and stories and practices 2,000 years is not that much of an issue for the tribes. And so we learn a lot about how they adapted to mega droughts in the West during the medieval drought periods, and how crops were changed and locations were changed. And so there's a lot more history, rich history of adapting to the land than simply what we can measure over the last 100 years. So, Nancy, you're asking a little bit more of fire on the landscape and the effect on the net carbon balance. Obviously, we don't have precise measurements of the effect on the carbon balance, but we know from traditional practices that fire was used. I'll give you one case example. So fire was used in the Lake Tahoe Basin by the Washoe tribe. They burned the meadows every year, almost every year probably, when they left. So they would come up to Tahoe for the summer, stay here, harvest. They're hunter and gatherers, so they're mostly gathering plants, traditional plants up here. At the end of the fall, they used fire on the landscape, not in our high fire season, in what we would consider low fire season. So they used fire in the landscape in the spring and in the fall. So they didn't typically result in catastrophic wildfires. As a result of burning the meadows when they left in the fall, when they came back in the spring, the plants that were critical for their culture had thrived. They had taken out some of the large woody trees, things like the lodgepole pines that tend to encroach in that area. So we know that in a lot of cases, the impact is much less because it's not catastrophic crown burning fires. It takes place in the non-catastrophic high fire season, and it tends to replenish understory growth that is native. Now, with the introduction of things, non-native plants, that's become more problematic. And I know that at least for the Salish Kootenai in Montana, where they use fire on the landscape a lot, they've had to contend with the reintroduction of, or the introduction of invasives that tend to come back in post-fire faster than some of the native plants and grasses. So I wish I could give a quantified measurement on the carbon balance, but certainly as a result of the landscape staying away from catastrophic crown burning fires, they're able collectively, probably on balance, to hold more carbon in the soils and plants than they were, than we're being subjected to with the catastrophic fires.
Okay, are there any more questions? We've listed the next seminar if you're interested in attending next Tuesday, Global Carbon Budget Accounting, following the State of the Carbon Cycle Report, the Regional Carbon Cycle Assessment and Processes Study, recap 2, and that'll be by Ben Pooler from NASA, so feel free to join us. And Jami has another question.
Okay, so Jami's question is, can I say something about how tribal communities have been included in the development and expansion of new energy sources and technologies in regions previously or currently dominated by coal production? Challenging, yes. There are programs, in particular from the Department of Energy, tribal programs that are dedicated to developing renewable energy on tribal lands, in particular to help with the transition away from coal and oil and gas. Those programs are pretty thin, I would say. There's, for instance, in the shutdown of the Navajo generating station, there are very few focused transition projects going on the reservation. The majority of people on the Navajo and Hopi reservations have no electricity in their houses and no running water. So there is an ample opportunity for development, mostly on like the community scale. So remember, these communities are, for the most part, maybe 20, 25 families living in an area in a particular region. It would be ripe for community development of solar, wind in the West. In some cases, in the Western, in Nevada, for instance, there's some geothermal production, and I know the tribes in eastern Nevada use the geothermal sources as irrigation, warm irrigation water. So they've been invested in that. But for the most part, I would say that the renewable energy development in tribal lands is way behind what it is on non-tribal lands. And I think there's a ample opportunity for that, as long as it can help them also compensate for the loss in economic revenue.
Then you have one more question.
That's for you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't see this. Can I get on the list for notification of the seminar? Yes, I will add you. Sorry, I couldn't see I stepped back and I couldn't see without my glasses. And I will also send a transcript of that talk. Thanks. Are there any other questions for Maureen or Jami? Okay, well, let's see what Jami says. Looks like she might. Oh, okay. Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you for listening. I appreciate your interest, and please feel free to contact me or Jami or Nancy, anybody on the SOCCR2 team if you have questions about this report.
Okay, and I just want to see what the last few folks are saying. C. Santos has a comment, and so does Jami. Thanks again, Maureen, and thanks for the setup, good setup session too.
Excellent. Glad we had a good attendance.
Yeah. C. Santos says, thank you for mentioning braiding sweetgrass. It really combines native and Western world views.
Absolutely, absolutely. Couldn't recommend it enough, and I quote it several times in the chapter.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Maureen, thanks again, and we hope you can join us next week. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks, Maureen. Thanks, Jami.